that's the spine of the book. And I'm going to take a look inside. Now these books are always really well illustrated. You can see on the inside of the cover, that's like a silhouette of presumably George III and two ladies. Might say inside a bit more about. Okay, so overleaf, George III portrait by Benjamin West. Here. And this is a plaque showing the head of George III from the Dutch house at Kew. So the book is from 1972. These are the chapters. Number 1, Prince and King. 2, Learning the Hard Way. 3, The American War. 4, The King in Subjection. 5, Calm and Prosperity. 6, Madness. 7, Revolution and Emancipation. And 8, The Last Years. So we're going to skip the introduction. And if you can hear some noise in the background, it's raining very heavily here today. So we're going to start with Chapter 1, Prince and King, 1738 to 62. I think this is a young George III sitting underneath a little tent that he's made out of chairs and a curtain, reading a book. Yeah, so it says drawing of George as a child playing soldiers in a tent constructed by flags over chairs. And then opposite at the top we have the Prince of Wales at a gaming table. One of his favourite pastimes. That's a drawing by Hogarth. Then below, Leicester Square in the mid-18th century. Leicester House, the London home of Frederick, Prince of Wales, in the four-courted building just right of the centre. Here, I think. Okay. George William Frederick, eldest son of Frederick, Prince of Wales and Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, was born at Norfolk House, St James Square, London, at 7:30 a.m. on the 4th of June, 1738. It was a premature birth. Augusta was taken in labour so unexpectedly that only one officer of state, Dr. Potter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, arrived in time for the delivery. The child seemed weak and was not expected to live, but survive it did, and by its very existence became an important factor in politics. The circumstance of the royal birth reflected an important feature Such men hoped that when the protege came to the throne, he would dismiss their enemies and install themselves in power. Prince Frederick was unpromising material for this tactic. As Duke of Cornwall, the Prince of Wales wielded considerable political influence in the West Country, but he lacked the persistence to produce results of real importance and seems to have been a weak character. Lord Hervey wrote, "His behaviour was something that gained one's good wishes, though it gave one no esteem for him. For his best qualities, whilst they prepossessed one the most in his favour, always gave one a degree of contempt for him at the same time. His carriage, whilst it seemed engaging to those who did not examine it, appeared mean to those who did. He had a father that abhorred him, a mother that despised and neglected him, a sister that betrayed him, a brother set up to pique, and a set of servants that neither were of use to him nor desirous of being so." It is hard to imagine that Frederick would have made a good king. He was one of nature's failures. He was rather like an overgrown child, happiest when with his children and writing short plays for them to perform. He was superstitious and made frequent visits to fortune-tellers in Norwood Forest. Although he cultivated pretty women, many believed that Frederick was impotent. Miss Anne Vane was being rather condescending. When she described the Prince of Wales in these matters ignorant to agree, inconceivable but not impotent, and as capable of having drilled children as any man in England, Frederick anticipated many of the failings of his grandson, the future Prince Regent, but, unlike George IV, he was never to face serious responsibility. Poor Fred died on the 20th of March, 1751, aged 48. Right, let me just go back to this picture. Yeah. So this is Frederick, Prince of Wales, and his family at Park Place, Henley, in about 1743. You can just kind of catch them at the bottom here with their carriages at the top of the hill. And on this side is Frederick, Prince of Wales, or Poor Fred, portrait by Highmore. And then here we have the title page of Histoire des Révolutions d'Angleterre by Le Père d'Orléans, one of the Jacobite books given to the Prince of Wales by his sub-governor Andrew Stone. Okay. Frederick's death made an enormous difference to his son George, who was created Prince of Wales a month before his 13th birthday. George II was 67, and a new reign could not be far away. Hitherto, the boy had led a sheltered life. He was very young for his years and had a poor grasp of reading and writing. Now his education became a political question. The 1750s were the greatest days of the Pelham family, headed by the Duke of Newcastle. The Pelhams and their relations had such influence in government that they came to think they had a right to power. They saw themselves as the guardians of the revolution of 1688, the heirs of the man who had deposed the Catholic despot James II and replaced him with the Protestant William of Orange. both spent much of their time in Germany, and George II in particular wanted a quiet life. The result was that royal power had been gradually eroded. With a determined young man on the throne, things might be very different. So this painting here is Augusta, Princess of Wales, wearing a black veil to show her recent widowhood, sitting with her children. In the background hangs a portrait of the deceased prince in his robes of state. Here. On the left of the group is George, Prince of Wales, showing a plan of the fortifications of Portsmouth to his brother Edward, Duke of York, in military uniform, painted in 1751 by George Napton. There's George. Okay, let's carry on. Stone's influence on George was small compared to the power exercised by his mother. Augusta was a stronger character than her husband. She was a devoted and domineering mother who dragooned her son to accept a rigid, essentially German attitude to religion and a crushing sense of duty. Augusta was ambitious, and her ideas of monarchy were decidedly absolutist. She had caused something of a sensation by hurling herself a full length on the floor when first presented to George II. Lord Hervey described her as rather tall and had health enough in her face, joined to a very modest and good-natured look, to make her countenance not disagreeable, but her person was far from being very ill-made, a good deal awry, her arms long and her motions awkward, had, in spite of all the finery of jewels and brocade, an ordinary air which no trapping could cover or exalt. Augusta took no part in politics while her husband was still alive. She had only to wait and she would be Queen of England. In 1751, the Princess of Wales was only 32 and had no intention of withdrawing into the modest seclusion of widowhood. She expected to exercise power through her son, and in this task she was helped by her friend, and probably more than friend, the Earl of Bute. According to Lord Chesterfield, the prince saw hardly anyone except his mother, Bute and personal servants, so that Bute came to have a very great influence over him. To the awkward young boy, he seemed the complete man of the world, whose advice, company, and friendship were eminently desirable. George II had never liked his daughter-in-law. According to some reports, he believed that an alliance with the House of Saxe-Gotha would bring evil and insanity into the royal family. Hereditary defects were indeed present, but the danger was greater in the king's own family than in his daughter-in-law's. George II wanted to free his grandson from Augustus. Apron strings. In 1755, when George was 17, the king found a young woman whom he believed would make an admirable bride for the Prince of Wales. The girl was the eldest daughter of the Duke of Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel. Augusta was a jealous and possessive mother who dreaded the loss of her son. If George had to marry, she planned to advance an impoverished and appropriately grateful young woman from her own family. Such a frightened creature would defer to her mother-in-law in all things. Now, let's see, this picture at the side is by William Hogarth. Brilliantly portrayed the brutality and depravity of London life in the mid-1800s. boyish exterior, however, George was developing an interest in women. Because of his secluded upbringing, he was all the more liable to make a fool of himself over a girl he fell in love with. Now, at the top here we have Quakers at a meeting in London. The sect had religious objections to the taking of any oaths. They thus experienced difficulties in testifying before courts of law and could not become borough councillors or members of Parliament. Okay, this was to be Hannah Lightfoot, the daughter of a Quaker tradesman from Execution Dock, Wapping in the east. It was not a salubrious area. Its rotting, disease-ridden courtyards could not have been very different from those described in horrifying detail by Henry Mayhew 100 years later. In the 1750s, the parish was a centre of cockfighting and bouts between female prize fighters. The main occupations were lighterage, street trading, petty thieving and prostitution. The industry, cleanliness and sobriety of the Quakers may have raised the Lightfoots a little above their neighbours. Later in the century, Quakerism was regarded as a rich man's religion, well represented in great brewing dynasties like the Berkeleys in the 1750s. It was still a poor man's belief, scarcely tolerated by the law. Neither the area nor the sect seemed likely to produce a woman believed by some to be the rightful Queen of England. Now here in this picture we have Dr. Syntax preaching, an engraving by Rowlandson showing Sunday service in an Anglican church. The congregation had to pay for the privilege of a seat in the pews, and the sermons were frequently long and boring. Miss Lightfoot had an uncle who was a successful linen draper in the West End. Early in 1754, Hannah was staying at the draper's home on the corner of Carlton Street and St Albans Place. In the arch words of a 19th century biographer, the house was interesting, perhaps as having been the last in which she was destined to press the pillow of innocence. Leicester House was not far away, and somewhere or other Hannah met the Prince of Wales. She was not, however, at all eager to become George's mistress. The contrast between her background and attitudes and those of the hard and elegant ladies of the court could not have been more striking. Her attraction for the shy young man to whom grandeur meant loneliness is easy to appreciate. Hannah's virtue only increased George's infatuation. In the end, Miss Chadley, who acted as a go-between for the prince, managed to fill the girl's head with visions of magnificence and to break down her remaining scruples. According to Hannah's family, she was married off to a Mr. Axford, but continued to be visited by the prince, by whom she had several children. So far as is known, Hannah never attempted to exploit her position and lived the remainder of her life in obscurity. If this is the whole story, it is just a repetition of the fate of many women who have taken royal lovers. Some people, mostly cranks it must be admitted, have asserted that Hannah was not George's mistress but his wife. A Secret History of the Court of England by Lady Anne Hamilton claims that the wedding took place sometime in 1759 at the Curzon Street Chapel, Mayfair, in the presence of George's younger brother. the ceremony between herself and the king. The book points to George's guilty conscience over his bigamy as the real cause of his future madness. Now at the top we have a cartoon showing George as Prince of Wales courting the fair Quakeress Hannah Lightfoot. The present Royal Marriages Act invalidates any union involving a member of the royal family who has not first obtained the sovereign's consent. The Act dates from 1772, and thus, if George did marry Hannah Lightfoot, on his accession she was the rightful Queen, and Charlotte's children, including the future George IV and William IV, were illegitimate. George was in love with Hannah Lightfoot and bore the scars of the relationship for some time, but this does not substantiate Lady Hamilton's allegations. The prince had too keen a sense of duty to his family and to the country to commit the incredible folly of marrying a Quakeress from execution dock. George, meanwhile, sought escape from personal problems by asking for employment in the army. George II, who was the last English king to lead his troops into battle at Dettingen in 1743, misconstrued his grandson's letter as a demand to be made commander-in-chief in the event of a French invasion. The old warrior king was determined to keep that position for himself, but Prince George had not long to wait. His grandfather's hearing and eyesight were failing. It seemed to the king that everyone's face was covered with black crape. Like his son Frederick, George II died suddenly at breakfast time on the 25th of October 1760, and the next day Prince George was proclaimed king. Unlike George II, who had destroyed his father's will, George III respected his grandfather's wishes. His private feelings about the late king were none too warm, but with the new sovereign, personal inclinations took second place to duty. A Mr. Clavering, a groom of the bedchamber, who refused to sit up at night with the corpse, was instantly dismissed. It was a king's mistress who normally lost most by his death. At one moment she was surrounded by flatterers, the next she had no status at all. In most instances she would now be mocked by her enemies and driven from court in disgrace. If her protector made provision for her, his successor often found a pretext to appropriate the legacy for himself. Lady Yarmouth fared better than most of her kind. £6,000 in banknotes was found in George II's desk, with a request that the money should go to her. George III not only complied, but added another 2,000 guineas. Okay, so I am going to leave it there. I hope you enjoyed the beginning of that history of George III. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers, saying I shall see you very, very soon.